Hi there, Dan here, and today I'm going to be doing a bit of a brief introduction and overview of the novels of the Change by S.M. Stirling, because they've got some of my favourite books in, and I'm going to be doing a reread of my favourite trilogy within the series. So I thought a bit of an introduction to it might be handy before those reviews come up. So this series includes the Nantucket trilogy and 15 novels in the Emberverse series. There's also a number of short stories that have been written based on the premise of the series, but I've read a fair few of them, but not all of them, and also none of them are really directly relevant to the plot of the main series, so I'm not really going to talk about them. So yeah, as you can see, it's a pretty long series, and I also think that although some of these books are up there with my all-time absolute favourites, the overall quality is actually pretty inconsistent. So I'll kind of give a bit of a rundown of my thoughts on that, how I'd split them up, and which ones are like must-reads and which ones you can probably avoid. So the novels of the Change, they're in the genre of alternate history or post-apocalyptic fiction in the main, but there's also elements of fantasy and science fiction. The events in the series begin to diverge from our own timeline on March 17th, 1998. The first book in the Nantucket trilogy was published in 1998, which is why this time has been chosen, I assume. Yeah, so on this day, a sort of strange, domed, electrical storm appears over the island of Nantucket. And the results of this storm are different for the people who are caught inside it, and for the people, and for the rest of the world. Yeah, so I've got the Nantucket trilogy here. You've got Island in the Sea of Time, Against the Tide of Years, and on the Oceans of Eternity. And this trilogy describes what happens to the inhabitants of the island of Nantucket as they are suddenly and without explanation transported back to 1250 BC. After working out what's happened, if not how it's happened, the islanders with no way of getting back have to start to work to create a new society without any of the benefits of the modern world. And of course, human nature being a thing, not all of the islanders are happy with their lot, and a group of renegades breaks off, and they sort of want to carve themselves an empire among the emerging civilizations of the time. So yeah, the trilogy is kind of a bit of a take on the sci-fi staple of someone being taken out of their own time, thrown back in time, and being able to introduce loads of technologies before their actual historical introduction. And I guess the sort of classic example of this is a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. But there's loads of examples of it. Army of Darkness, that weird film with Bruce Campbell in it. But by having a whole island transported back in the past, Stirling is able to accelerate the spread of these ideas in the alternate timeline, as the Nantucketers already have a bunch of people with various skills and a load of modern equipment there on the island at their disposal from the get-go. And while they initially have to struggle to survive and get through some really difficult years initially, they go on by the end of the trilogy to sort of become the dominant global power. So yeah, overall I'd say this is a really strong part of the Change series. It's got a really strong cast of characters who've got loads of agency and diversity and nuance to them. And it's this, along with Stirling's excellent world building, that really stand out in this trilogy. The nature of the premise means that the characters are essentially doing the world building themselves, as their decisions have a massive impact on the development of the alternate timeline. Now, although the Nantucket trilogy was published before the rest of the Emberverse series, you really don't have to read it first if you don't want it. You could fit it in anywhere amongst the other books. It's kind of its own discrete story, and it's only loosely linked to the remaining 15 Emberverse proper books. The inciting incident is the same, and some of the characters from the Nantucket trilogy have like really small cameos in the rest of the series, but I mean really you don't need any prior knowledge of that to understand the Emberverse series, and it's not going to affect it much if you do. It's just a little Easter egg. So right, yeah, on to the Emberverse then. As I said, there's 15 books in this series, and they really are pretty variable quality. Some of them are up there with my absolute favourites, and some of them I could take or leave. So I'll talk you through my thoughts on that as I go. But first of all, the premise. So yeah, March 17th, 1998, there's that unexplained event that shoots Nantucket back in time. But for everyone else in the world, the consequences are sort of completely different. No time travel for them, but instead, suddenly all high technology stops working for no reason that anyone is aware of. It's like there's just an instantaneous change in the laws of physics. All like electronics stops working, all, internal combustion engines stop working, even explosives and gunpowder stop working. So the first trilogy, which I've got here, there we go. If you can see that, you got Dies the Fire, the Protector's War, and a meeting at Corvallis. Yeah, there's Dies the Fire. Really nice cover, I think. City burning in the background. Ordinary looking guy with a sword. So yeah, the first trilogy, the Dies the Fire trilogy, concentrates on the first 10 years after the change, which is what the event becomes known as. And it's mainly focused on the Willamette Valley in Oregon. So Dies the Fire, the first book, deals with the immediate aftermath as modern civilization collapses, the vast majority of the human race dies off, and groups form based around a mutual need to survive. The second and third books pick up a few years later than this, when these original communities are more established and starting to come into conflict with each other. Now, for me, this trilogy is basically the best books in the series, and it rates pretty damn high on my all-time favourite, trilogy series books of all time list. Stirling's character work throughout is sort of fantastic. He builds relationships brilliantly. His world building is some of the best I've seen. The way the post-change communities develop and start to take on their own personalities feels very organic, and it borrows heavily from history, but feels really original and fresh at the same time. I mean, don't get me wrong, the books aren't perfect, and some people might not get on with Stirling's writing style, or his sense of humour perhaps. He tells some pretty corny jokes, but if you can get past that. Also, the overall plot is pretty functional, does what it needs to, it's not spectacular, but I mean, to my mind, that gives you more time to focus on what the really main strengths of this series are, which is the character work and the world building. So the next part of the Change series is the sort of biggest chunk, and it consists of 7 books, which I've got here. Oh. So there's the first 3 that I've got in paperback. You've got the Sunrise Lands, the Scourge of God, and Sword of the Lady. And then I've got these 4 in hardback. I'm not going to go through all the names, but yeah. Yeah, so this 7-part section opens 22 years after the change, and in this we follow the second generation of characters, a lot of whom are children of characters from the Dies the Fire trilogy. And in this we see the transition of the original communities that we were following into a sort of nascent, benevolent empire that they call the High Kingdom of Monteval, rather grandiosely. And we also see their conflict with the Church Universal and Triumphant, or the CUT, who are definitely the baddies, as well as, on the side, well, not on the side, quite a main part of it is there's a sort of quest by a ragtag group to find a magic sword. And this part of the series is really where the fantasy elements that were hinted at earlier in the series, in both the Nantucket trilogy and the Dies of the Fire trilogy, this is where they really start to come to the fore. Stirling starts to hit a lot of traditional fantasy tropes, like the looming evil empire, the chosen one, the quest for the magic sword, etc., etc. But it's really interesting to see them play out in his unique setting. I'd say this part of the series is still a pretty decent read, but personally I think he could have played down the really overt fantasy elements a bit, and it would have added a sense of mystery where you're kind of wondering, is it magic, is it not? And also the pacing starts to go off a bit. I think the 7 books could have quite easily been reduced to like 4 or 5 without reducing the overall impact of the story. The quest for the magic sword section feels quite dragged out. I mean, it stretches out over a number of books. That could have certainly been cut down. And it might have been nice to give the bad guys a bit more nuance as well, because they are straight up, evil. Overall, though, I really like this part of the series. It's just because of those, few slight problems, it's not quite up there with the Dies of the Fire trilogy. Right, yeah, so then the story picks up for the final 5 books, which I've got here. There you go. Actually, I tell a lie. I haven't got all 5 books. I've got 4 of them. The last one in the series was released last year, and I haven't got around to picking that up yet. So, the final book I haven't read. So yeah, now we are 46 years after the change, and we're with the grandkids of the original protagonist. 3 generations in. I'm not going to go too much into this part of the series in terms of the synopsis, because this is really where it kind of starts to tail off in terms of quality. The different plot threads start to feel very disconnected, and it becomes more difficult to suspend disbelief for the fantasy elements. I mean, by the way, I'm a huge fantasy fan. I read loads of fantasy, but they just feel slightly out of place or a bit incongruous in this setting for some reason. But the characters are still well written, but to be honest, unless you're a fan of the rest of them, I wouldn't bother with these. Definitely don't start with them. So, there you go. That's the novels of the change. Overall, I guess in summary, the Dies of the Fire trilogy is some of the best post-apocalyptic fiction I have read, and it is definitely in my recommended reading for absolutely anyone. The Nantucket trilogy and the second part of the Emberverse series, the 7-book section, I'd say that is still really good quality, a really enjoyable read, just not quite up at the level of the Dies of the Fire trilogy. And after that, you've got the last 5 books, which, it kind of feels like Stirling got a bit bored of writing the series, or he got burned out, ran out of steam with it, which is a shame, but that doesn't change the fact that this series has got some absolutely cracking books in it. So, yeah, if you like any kind of alternate history, post-apocalyptic fiction, that kind of thing, fish out of water, sci-fi type stories, then, yeah, this is one of the best I've read, so highly recommended series.